Well, good morning this 5th of July, the day after the 4th, and judging from the number of people in here, maybe the old axiom is true. Have a 5th on the 4th and you can't go 4th on the 5th? I don't know. Maybe not. We're a church. Maybe that doesn't apply here. But we started having services live again at the crossing last week, and so there are people here. There are people in the courtyard for a live service out there now, so we're trying to provide all kinds of opportunities for you to come back. But most of you are watching online, which is great. That's a perfectly legitimate thing to do, and we're glad that you're able to join us this morning. I want to take a moment and look at a picture that's really a collage of other pictures. So let's take a moment right now and put that on the screen. What do you see? I mean, you see a little picture of a fish, a little picture of a rabbit, a little picture of maybe a snake, fish, I said that, other stuff there. Let's pan out a little bit more, and you can see kind of that was part of a bigger whole. And now you look and you see other things, an ape, little other things that are around there, kind of elk, deer-looking thing, some other things. Now, if we pan out one more, that all these photos comprise a picture of Jesus, obviously an artistic rendering. There is no photo of Jesus. An artistic rendering done by a computer. You can take these photos now, and a computer can take photographs and render another photograph, which is kind of an amazing thing when you think about it. My favorite is one of John Lennon composed of Beatle album covers. But you can do photo mosaics, do a search for that on Google, and it's kind of cool, the stuff. But the reason I wanted to do that was not to show you something cool. I wanted to show you how I think what the whole Bible is. In Luke 24, when Jesus rose from the dead, he told his disciples, you know, the whole Scripture, the whole what we would call the Old Testament, the entire Old Testament was about him. All the stories, everything that happens is ultimately a picture of Jesus. It's about Jesus. And that's not only a great way to think about what's the Bible, when I'm reading an individual story in the Bible, how is this comprising the bigger picture of Jesus? That's always a really important question to ask. It's not just a story unto itself. But it's also an important question to ask when we're reading through Genesis. I'm amazed. One of the things I really am just in awe of Genesis, as old as it is how it's so foreshadowing of Jesus, and it points to something really important to know and understand about Jesus, and that's certainly true in the story we're going to begin today. Not going to cover the whole story because it's kind of the story that covers the rest of Genesis in some ways. But we're going to begin the story in Genesis 37 because it really is one of those chapters that does exactly what that photo mosaic does. It's like one of these stories is clearly part of a bigger whole. Now remember, the story of Joseph begins when finally Rachel had her first child. After all these years of not being able to have kids, finally Rachel has a child, and she names him Joseph. And then years go by, and eventually Jacob and his family, his 4 wives and sons and daughters, leave where they were. They were in kind of a refugee over about 500 miles northeast of the land of Canaan. Now they're coming back, and they came back. Keith talked about that last week when they came back, and Jacob confronted Esau, or I should say apologized to Esau. He had to confront him on his way back to the land of Canaan. Years have gone by, and we begin the story in Genesis 37 when now Joseph is 17 years old, and he has 10 older brothers. He has a younger brother named Benjamin who was born in chapter 35, and when he was born, Rachel died, giving birth. So Joseph is the second youngest. He's got 10 older brothers, and we pick up the story in chapter 37, verse 3. It says that now Israel, now you're thinking, wait, what? Israel, we skipped it, chapter 32. Shay's going to cover it next week, but just, we kind of did a little order shuffling. But God changed Jacob's name to Israel. So it's important to understand that Jacob is Israel. All his descendants will become Israel. These are the sons of Jacob, the story's about, the children of Israel, and eventually it's going to be the nation of Israel. They're going to be called Israelites. You kind of know the rest of the story. But Jacob is the first Israel. His name is Israel. Now, Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons. Here we go. Because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made a richly ornamented robe for him. Perhaps you've heard of that robe in other situations. It continues, when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and cannot speak a kind word to him. So here's what we have. We have this repeated generational dysfunction in this family of Israel through whom God's going to bless all the people on earth. It started with Isaac, Jacob's father, loving his brother Esau. Isaac loved his son Esau, Jacob's brother, more than he loved Jacob. Jacob's mother Rebekah loved Jacob more than she loved Esau, and that caused this hostility and conflict between Jacob and Esau. Keith talked about that even last week. And then Jacob loves Rachel more than he loves Leah, and that causes this denigration of their lives as they have this hostility toward one another because of Jacob's dysfunctional affection. And now Jacob loves Joseph more than his other sons, and that's caused an incredible hostility and hatred between the brothers and Jacob. You get the point. This is a dysfunctional family that continues to repeat this sin. It continues in verse 5. Joseph had a dream, and the story begins with this. This is kind of kicking off the entire story that's going to be 14 chapters. Joseph had a dream. And when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. Now here's why. Kind of in how he said it. He said to them, listen to this dream I had. It's weird. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it. Isn't that weird? Now he's 17, a little cocky, a little naive. This doesn't go well. His brothers said to him, do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us? Now the answer to the question, because this is all foreshadowing, the answer to the question is yes. Jacob will one day rule not just over his family, but he's going to be a ruler over all of Egypt. He's going to become Pharaoh's right-hand man. He's going to save Egypt. He's eventually going to save this family from an incredible 7-year famine. And so he will eventually become a ruler in Egypt. He's going to dress like an Egyptian ruler. He's going to have all the privileges of an Egyptian ruler. He's going to ride in a chariot through the streets. And that's going to become Joseph. The dream is true. It's going to happen. The story continues. Now, his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem. So, you know how it is, a nomadic people, they have these flocks of goats, and you can't just use the same grass that it gets eaten up. They have to keep going further and further away to find new grass to feed all these goats. They end up going to this place called Shechem, and Israel, Jacob, said to Joseph, go and see if all is well with your brothers when with the flocks, and bring word back to me. When Joseph arrived at Shechem, so he'd gone a ways away, he gets there, they're not there. A man found him wandering around in the fields and asked him, what are you looking for? He replied, I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they are grazing their flocks? Continues. They have moved on from here, the man answered. I heard them say, let's go to Dothan. So this man appears out of nowhere. He sees Joseph sort of playing in the dirt in right field. He's a 17-year-old guy. He can't find his brothers. He's wandering aimlessly throughout the fields, and this guy just sort of pops out of nowhere onto the scene and points him to Dothan. And so it says Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan. Now, the next verse says, actually verse 12 says, but they saw him in the... 12, never mind, forget what I'm saying. The next verse. They saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they start plotting with one another. And here's what it is. They plotted to kill him. They're going to kill their little brother because they're angry because of the hostility. So the next verse says, come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. Now, how are we doing here? Think about the moral compass of this family. They're going to kill their little brother because they're angry at him for his dreams. And what happens is that this story is thousands of years old. We have today this kind of same plot, although this has got to be the first or one of the first. The same plot in movies, books, TV shows, where in trying to prevent a prediction from coming true, you actually put into play the circumstances that cause it to happen. That's what's going to happen with this story. They're in trying to prevent Joseph's dreams from coming true. Now they're going to start a chain reaction of events that's going to actually make it come true. So the next verse says, when Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue. Reuben's the older brother, right? He was the firstborn to Leah, first of Jacob's sons. He tried to rescue him from their hands. Let's not take his life, he said, continues. Don't shed any blood. Throw him into this cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him. Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. That was his intention. Now, these cisterns in the wilderness that Reuben is talking about are still there to this day. They're dug holes in the limestone. You can see a photo of it here. They're holes that are dug in the limestone, and they're meant to gather rainwater. And it's not a well, it's like a tank that the rainwater goes into and sits in there. And you can see that what Reuben wants to do is save his little brother from being killed. And so he says, let's throw him in this dark hole. And they all go, yeah, okay. And so we go back to the text, and it says, so when finally Joseph gets there, when Joseph came to his brothers, they've got the plan, and they stripped him of his robe, and they took him and they threw him in the cistern, this dark hole, and the cistern was empty. There was no water in it. It continues, as they sat down to eat their meal. So just, again, picture this family. They're wanting to kill their little brother. They're still thinking about it. In the meantime, they throw him in this dark hole, and one of them says, you know what, I'm hungry. And so they sit down and they have a meal as they're thinking about killing their little brother. Again, how are we doing here with this family? And they looked up and they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. So it just so happens, as they're eating their meal, threw their little brother in the hole, trying to figure out if they're going to kill him, a caravan comes by on its way to Egypt. And Judah, one of the brothers, fourth oldest, said to his brothers, you know what? What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood. His brothers agreed. So here's the thing. Now they've decided, okay, we won't gain anything by killing our little brother. Let's sell him as a slave. Let's just sell him into slavery. And all the brothers agreed. Now, how's this family doing? Way worse than yours. Whenever you get discouraged by the dysfunction in your family, remember this family. This family that God, through whom promised all the nations on earth would be blessed. This family that God was blessing and had a plan of redemption through. If God can do something through this family, he can for sure do something through yours, even with all of its dysfunction. It helps me. I feel better when I remember the family of the Bible. And sometimes we think, okay, these are biblical characters. This is Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Judah, and all this kind. And we think these are the people who are examples of the faith. But when we really read the Bible, we realize they're examples of what God has to redeem. They're examples of dysfunction. They're examples of brokenness. That's what we read when we read the Bible. The story continues. So, when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites who took him to Egypt. So now that the story's transitioning, then they got Joseph's robe, that robe that they're kind of mad at, slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe in the blood. They took the ornamented robe back to their father and said, I don't know, we just kind of were coming back and we found this. Examine it to see whether it's your son's robe. He recognized it and said, it is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces. It continues, all his sons and daughters came to comfort him. So here they're trying to comfort Joseph. Now, if you're noticing something strange, me too. They can comfort him. They can tell him the truth. He's not dead, but they don't. They're just kind of falsely trying to comfort him. But he refused to be comforted. No, he said, in mourning will I go down to the grave to my son. So his father wept for him. Now, this is near the end of the chapter, but it's not the end of the chapter. Instead of ending here with Joseph weeping Jacob weeping for his son Joseph as if that's the end of the story of Joseph. There's one more verse, and it begins this way. It says, "Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard." Meanwhile. See, the chapter ends with that first word, this word that changes everything in the story. Meanwhile. The story's not over. Meanwhile. And the reason why there's a meanwhile and it doesn't end with just Jacob weeping over Joseph, the reason why there's a meanwhile is because the most prominent character in this entire chapter is someone who's never mentioned, and that's God. In just this first chapter of this story of Joseph, we see God orchestrating all of these tragic events. God is creating this sad story. God's the one who's causing this tragic story to happen. And that word meanwhile means that the story's not over. But we see God working in the story because, see, remember, it's the dreams that Joseph had that began to intensify his brother's hatred of him. Now, the dreams really were foreshadowing of the end of the story. They really were prophetic. It was God giving Joseph the dreams. They came true eventually. But the dreams put into play a set of circumstances that by themselves would be utterly tragic, but they're not by themselves. There's a meanwhile. We also see God working in this random guy that appears out of nowhere. And Joseph is wandering around in the fields. He's going to probably go home. He's not going to find his brothers because they've gone on to Dothan. And so instead of having the story end where he goes home and he goes back to Jacob and all is well, no. Some mysterious guy comes out of nowhere and goes up to Joseph and points him to where his brothers had gone. Well, who's he? I don't know. Somebody weird that comes out of nowhere and continues the story toward tragedy. Well, tragedy if it was by itself without the meanwhile. We see God orchestrating these sad events that creates this tragedy by this caravan of Ishmaelites. Reuben had a plan. Reuben was trying to let his brothers calm down. Let's throw him in the pit. He'll figure out a way to get him out and take him back to his dad. He's the oldest brother. He'll figure it out. But no. Now all of a sudden, this caravan comes by of Ishmaelites, Midianites, same thing. And they're there at just the right time, at just the right place. For now, Joseph, instead of going home to his dad with Reuben, he's going to be sold as a slave to Egypt. Think about how that happened. These Midianites at one point said, you know what? Let's go sell our stuff to Egypt. When do you want to go? I don't know. Let's go Friday. What time? Well, let's go Friday in the morning sometime. So they get their caravan packed up. They get their camels packed up. But then all of a sudden something happens and they leave in the afternoon instead of the morning. I'm just making up a scenario, but we've all gone on trips and we all know how it happens. You never leave but however you leave, whenever you leave, you've made that decision completely on your own. But somehow in God orchestrating things, their decisions that they were making completely on their own, maybe one of the camels had a flat tire, I don't know, but it caused things to happen so that this caravan of camels of Midianites going to Egypt just happens at the very right time, at the very right place to be when they're eating the meal and they look up and see him and get a new plan. Now, it's not just me saying this. It's not just me saying, isn't it cool how God's orchestrating this tragic story? It's Joseph himself who says it. Because it does come true, and Joseph does become a ruler in Egypt. He's feared by his family. They do come there. They see him again because they're starving to death, and they're very afraid of him. And here's what he says in chapter 45, verse 5. He says, "Do not be distressed, and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here." Now, you did it, but don't be distressed and angry, because it was to save lives that God sent me. Did you see that? God sent me ahead of you. When did God send Joseph to Egypt? Well, through all these decisions of evil, even, we would say, on the part of his brothers, and the decisions of evil on the part of the merchants to be slave traders. A lot of evil decisions happened But somehow Joseph says, you know what, it wasn't that at all. It was, but it wasn't. It was God sending me. He says it again, verse 7, he says, God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then, it was not you who sent me here. This is the third time he says it. It wasn't you who sent me here, but God. Somehow God's orchestrating all these smaller pictures into a bigger picture. Somehow God is orchestrating all these smaller decisions into an event where it's actually God doing the doing. Even in the intention of evil on their part, God is working to save, because see, what happens is Israel would have starved to death. Jacob and his family would have starved to death. Future Israel would have starved to death, and there'd be no Old Testament. There'd be no story. There'd be no ultimate offspring through whom all the nations of the earth are blessed. There'd be no Jesus, and there'd be no great deliverance. But because God sent Joseph in all these tragic circumstances and decisions, God sent Joseph in these things that would otherwise be just random bad luck, but there's a meanwhile, and in the meanwhile, it was God sending Joseph so that there could be a great deliverance. And this is where you and I enter the story. Because see, it's not just about, well, let's look at the very last chapter of Genesis. Joseph even makes it stronger. He says this in chapter 50, verse 20, as for you, you meant evil. There's no soft pedaling it. You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. Somehow in the same act, what they meant for evil against Joseph, and they did it, and they did the evil, somehow in the same event, there's a meanwhile, God is acting to orchestrate, to bring about good. God meant it for good, to bring about that many people's lives should be kept alive as they are today. But it's not just about Joseph. This is not just about an Old Testament story. It's about you and me. Because the New Testament has that verse. If you've been a Christian for a while, you know it. It's one of the Bible's greatest hits, Romans 8:28. And we know, now we sometimes forget and we don't always believe what we know, but we know that God causes all things. All things. God causes all things. You know what that word means in the Greek, all things? It means all things. God causes all things to work together, to be a mosaic. I don't know how this picture of a fish and a puppy and an ape makes a picture of Jesus, but God knows. God causes all things, I don't know if you believe this, but we know that God causes all things to work together for good because He's infinite in His wisdom and He has a plan, He has a purpose. And if we just trust Him, it's all going to work out for good. Trust Him is a synonym of love Him, because when you trust God, you love Him. See, only God has the big picture. Only God knows how He's orchestrating and working together all of these different things and decisions and events that happen in our lives. So somehow they're all working together to make this mosaic that God intends for your good, because He has an intense, steadfast love for you, and He has an infinite wisdom, He has an infinite purpose. He is somehow working these things together if you would just trust Him. That's why none of the painful circumstances in our life can be understood if we just look at them by themselves, because they're never by themselves. There's always a meanwhile. God is always putting them and inserting them right here to make a bigger picture. If a computer can do it, think of the infinite God who created this universe with infinite wisdom, can take every story in your life and He's making a picture for good according to His infinite purpose. Now, how that works in our life, and our decisions and the evil things that happen and the seemingly random things that happen, how all that works is complicated to say the least, right? I mean, it's far more mystery than it is clarity to it. There's tons of unanswered questions. We just know somehow it's what the Bible teaches. There's a story happening right now with a a couple in our church, Tanya and Jason Gooden, and their two kids. They have two kids together, Grant and Grace. And there's a story happening right now that is this story here is an illustration of what they're going through. Now, we've known Jason and Tanya for a long time. They've been part of this church a long time. I officiated their wedding years ago. I love them a lot, not more than you, but I love them a great deal, and many of you love them as well because they're an important part of our church. But I wanted to give them a chance to tell their story in case somehow we can help, you can help in some way. Let's take a moment and listen to what they have to say.
Every parent wants healthy children. I mean, I think that's like one of the most important things you just pray about before you ever have a child. And so when you start to see them maybe lagging behind their peers, you kind of go, okay, well, is this anything? Is this nothing?
Things just always seem like a little difficult, more so than other families. I noticed Grace was starting to need a little help when she was 3. And then in 2016 is when she was diagnosed with autism. And so that kind of explained a lot. We're like, oh, okay, this is what's going on. So January 2016 was a huge month for us. Grace was diagnosed with autism. Grant was diagnosed with a growth hormone deficiency.
It was a lot. I mean, it was a lot. But then it keeps getting worse.
We thought 2016 would be the hardest year we would ever have. And we were wrong.
Because Grace wasn't growing, she went and saw the same specialist that Grant was seeing. They ended up ordering a very detailed genetic panel, and that's when we found out that Grace had multiple sulfatase deficiency. I just looked online, and I was like, I've never even heard about this in all my medical school. Just reading quick one sentence I could find was rare childhood disease, average age of death 10 years old, and it just kind of had to think that life was never going to be the same after that. Children become blind, they can't hear, they can't walk, that they basically develop symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. They won't be able to swallow, eventually they won't be able to breathe. You remember this part?
Oh yeah, I got it.
Finger, put your finger right there.
Yeah, I got it.
Ready?
Grace was diagnosed February 15th of 2019. And then there was a short period in between that we truly prayed that Grant wouldn't have it. And when Grace went to her first MSD appointment, literally I had a spreadsheet of how similar Grace and Grant were. I mean, truly our worst nightmare came true, that both children would have MSD. When I got the call, it was just literally life-shattering. It was the worst news a parent could hear. Our precious, sweet babies that we brought into this world have quite possibly the worst possible diagnosis that you could get. And there's so little information for the doctors that they can't even give you hope, that basically you go home and just be with your children because there's no treatment, there's no cure. With multiple sulfatase deficiency, I mean, it steals your children away. I mean, they'll become a shadow of who they are today until they're just not here anymore.
For the first 2 months, I pretty much laid in bed and cried when I was not working. I've lived my whole adult life basically being in control of everything. At least I always think I'm in control. You work harder, you work longer, you put in the time, and you can achieve whatever you put your mind to. And when you have something like MSD, you have no control. I can't do anything about it.
Say Sparrow and Mom and Dad.
It wouldn't be so hard if you knew how this was going to end. But he sent his son to die on the cross. Like, he knew when Jesus was born, like, he knew how that was going to end. It wasn't going to end well, right? I mean, not in a physical sense. I mean, it was pain and suffering. I think that God's given, like, Ty and I a gift just by letting our kids be as healthy as they are.
I truly feel like I hear this gentle whisper of God saying, trust me. I know no matter what this plan is, that He is in control. He has this plan for us. And no matter what happens in our lives in this situation, God is writing this book. This isn't our book to write.
If it were their book to write, they wouldn't write it, right? This is incredibly painful. So unlikely, the odds. But like Tanya said, God's writing His book. It's not a book we'd write, but we just got to trust Him. You know, by itself, this would seem like such a meaningless, random event, but it's not by itself. God has a meanwhile. We don't know what it is. They don't know what it is, but somehow, if the Bible's true, if Jesus came, died on the cross, rose from the dead, and the Bible's true, and I believe Jesus did, so I believe it is, if it's true, that means somehow God is using this as an important part of this orchestrated picture. And it's the same with you and me. You don't know how your life is going to play out. I mean, even now, the pandemic, the economy, your job, your finances, the cultural turmoil, political turmoil. We don't know how this year is going to play out. I don't remember a more unpredictable, turbulent year since 1968. I know it's a cliche, but it's true. We don't know how it's going to turn out, but somehow we know only God has the big picture. And only God knows how He is orchestrating every circumstance in your life, bad decisions, good decisions, bad luck, but it's not bad luck. Somehow God's orchestrating everything to make His big mosaic of His good purpose according to His infinite wisdom and steadfast love for you and me. All we got to do is trust Him. Just like Tanya and Jason. It's all you can do. Would you pray with me? Heavenly Father, we want to trust you. We want to trust that somehow, even though we can't see it, you're the God that created this universe. Your infinite wisdom is working all circumstances in our life. You promise for good. According to your good plan and purpose, you're building a mosaic in all the things and all the circumstances in our lives and beyond our lives. And so we trust you. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Would you stand to receive God's blessing? May God work everything, all things in your life together for good, according to His infinite purpose and wisdom and steadfast love for you. Amen. Thanks for worshiping with us today. Thanks for worshiping with us today. Those of you who are here on your way out, please give people their space. Their real estate of 6 feet would be great. Thanks for coming.